I picked up somewhere the whisper before I picked up the words themselves, my daughter-in-law's voice, low and satisfied, coming through the guest bathroom wall. Once he signs the transfer papers, the lake house is basically ours, honey. He doesn't even use it anymore. 3 nights later, at a dinner party with people I'd never met, my son laughed into his wine glass and said, "Honestly, my father's just dead weight at this point. Sweet old guy, but dead weight." He had no idea the dead weight he was talking about had closed the year at $740,000 in personal income. He was about to find out, and it was going to cost him almost everything he thought he'd already won. Welcome back. If you're new here, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I mean that. A quick note before we start. Some details in this story have been adjusted for privacy, the way I've always done, but the heart of it is true, and I think you'll feel that as we go. My name is Harold Whitfield. I'm 71 years old, and the most valuable thing on my kitchen counter is a coffee percolator that belonged to my father, older than I am, older than the house it sits in. I don't drink fancy coffee. I drink the same percolated coffee I've been drinking since I was a young man, learning how to run a business out of the back of a hardware store in Dayton, Ohio, and I see no reason to change that now. I live alone in a modest brick house on a street called Larkspur Lane, in a town outside Dayton, where everybody still waves from their porch and nobody locks their car doors at night. Not really. Out of habit more than necessity. My neighbor on the left is a widow named Ruth who feeds every stray cat in a 4-block radius. My neighbor on the right is a young family, 2 kids, a trampoline they never asked permission to put too close to the fence line, and I've never once said a word about it, because there's something about the sound of children laughing in a backyard that I've come to treasure more than quiet. Every morning starts the same. I'm up before 6, feet on the cold hardwood, because the cold is the only alarm clock that's never once failed me. I make my coffee the way my father taught me, measured, patient, no shortcuts, and while it drips, I stand at the window and look out at my wife's rose garden. Eleanor planted those roses the year before the cancer took her. 9 years ago this coming spring. I've kept every bush alive since, even the stubborn one by the fence that fights me every summer. Eleanor used to say that stubborn rose bush and I had a lot in common. She wasn't wrong. After coffee, I read the paper, the actual paper, because I like the sound it makes and the ink it leaves on my fingers. Then I walk 2 miles, same streets, same order, past the Methodist church and the closed-down Five and Dime, and back home along Larkspur. People ask if I ever get tired of the sameness. I tell them the sameness is the point. A man my age doesn't need more surprises. He needs a floor he can trust under his feet. Now, before you build the picture in your head, retired man, modest brick house, percolator older than his grandchildren, let me fill in what that picture leaves out, because I've watched people draw the wrong conclusions about me my entire adult life, and for most of that time, I let them. 43 years ago, I started a small parts distribution company out of that hardware store I mentioned, moving specialty fasteners and industrial hardware to machine shops across 3 states, back when that meant driving the delivery route myself in a truck with a cracked windshield I never got around to fixing. Unglamorous work. Nobody writes songs about bolt suppliers. But over 3 decades, I built Whitfield Fastener and Supply into the largest independent distributor of its kind in the Midwest. And in 2009, I sold it not to the highest bidder, but to a company I trusted to keep my employees' jobs intact, which mattered more to me than the extra $2 million sitting on the table from the other offer. What I kept from that sale was a minority stake in the buyer's parent company, which has more than tripled in value since. I kept the deed to a small commercial warehouse I still lease out to a machine shop 2 towns over. And I kept a friendship with a man named Council Reyes, who has managed my investments since before my son was born, and who still, to this day, wears the same brand of watch he wore the year we met, because Council doesn't believe in changing something that already works. Between the equity, the lease, income, and 30 years of patient investing, my income runs somewhere around $740,000 a year. I drive a 2011 Chevy Silverado with 190,000 miles on it. I buy my work boots at the farm supply store. Nobody in my daily life has the faintest idea And until recently, I preferred it that way. Harold, don't you think Michael should know the truth? Counsel asked me once, maybe 6 years back, sitting across from me in his office with a coffee he'd paid too much for and barely touched. Michael is my son. He's 42 now, runs a mid-sized commercial construction firm out of Columbus, decent-sized projects, a few dozen employees, the kind of business a man builds with his hands and his stubbornness. He built it from almost nothing, the same way I did. And if I'm honest with myself in the particular way, a man can only be honest at 6 in the morning while the percolator gurgles and the roses catch the first light. I am proud of him. I just don't always recognize the man that pride grew into. He knows what he needs to know, I told Counsel that day. That's not the same as what's true, Counsel said. No, I agreed, it isn't. I stood at my kitchen window the morning everything changed. Coffee in both hands, looking at the photograph on the shelf above the sink. Michael at 9 years old, Eleanor's arm draped over his shoulders, me squinting into the sun with the specific expression of a man who'd been told to smile and forgotten how somewhere between, say, cheese and the shutter click. A fishing trip on Lake Erie, the summer before Michael started 4th grade. I said out loud, to nobody, to the photograph, maybe to Eleanor, I thought I raised a good man. Nobody answered. They never do. Then I heard it. A low groan from somewhere under the house, followed by a hiss that didn't belong in a quiet kitchen at 6 in the morning. By the time I got the crawl space hatch open, I understood. The foundation had shifted over the winter. The inspector later called it settling, a word that sounds so much gentler than what it actually meant, and it had cracked the main water line running under my kitchen and half the living room. Within an hour, I had 2 inches of standing water spreading across floors. Eleanor had picked out the tile for with her own hands. I called a contractor, a straight-talking man named Dwayne, who I'd used twice before. Dwayne came out, went under the house, and came back up with the look of a man who's delivered bad news often enough to do it without flinching. Harold, it's not just the line, he said. The foundation's compromised on that whole east side. You're looking at real work here. Weeks, not days. And you can't be living in this house while we're tearing up the floor and shoring up the footing underneath it. I called Michael that evening, and I want to be honest with you about how I felt doing it, because I think that honesty matters. I didn't want to call him, not because I don't love my son, I do, more than the words I have for it, but because some part of me already knew what kind of week I was walking into, the way you know a storm is coming from, the particular stillness in the air before it arrives. Dad, of course. Come stay with us, Michael said, and I could hear real warmth in it, or something close enough to warmth that I let myself believe it. We've got the guest room. Stay as long as you need. I packed 2 suitcases and drove the 90 minutes to Columbus that Thursday. Michael's house sits in a development called Sterling Oaks, the kind of neighborhood where every driveway has at least one car with a bow on it in December. Every lawn is cut in the same diagonal pattern, and every house looks like it was designed by someone who'd only ever seen houses in a magazine. His wife, Danielle, met me at the door with a smile that didn't quite make it all the way to her eyes, and a hug that lasted exactly as long as a hug is supposed to last, and not 1 second longer. Harold, we're so glad you're here, she said, and then, almost in the same breath, the guest room's actually being used for Michael's home office right now, so we set you up down in the basement. It's very cozy, though. We just redid the carpet. The basement room was, in fact, cozy, in the way a room is cozy when it used to be a laundry room and someone put a twin bed and a lamp in it and called it done. I didn't say anything about it. I've never been a man who complains about a roof over his head, even when the roof in question is 9 feet below everyone else's. The first few days were fine, strained in the particular way that houses get strained when a person who doesn't belong to the daily rhythm of a household is suddenly living inside it, but fine. I tried to make myself useful, fixed a sticking cabinet hinge, took the trash out before anyone asked, kept mostly out of the way. Michael was polite in the distracted manner of a man with too much on his mind, and I noticed that, the way you notice weather changing before anyone else mentions it. He was on the phone constantly, in low, tight tones, pacing his backyard patio with his free hand pressed against his forehead. It was the following Tuesday when I overheard the conversation about the lake house. I want to be precise about this, because precision matters when you're telling the truth. I wasn't eavesdropping, not exactly. I was coming down the hallway toward the guest bathroom, my footsteps quiet on the new carpet Danielle had mentioned, and her voice carried through the door of what used to be, I'd learn later, a converted closet she used as a little home office of her own. Once he signs the transfer papers, the lake house is basically ours, honey. He doesn't even use it anymore. A pause, and then, softer, almost gleeful, we could have the closing done before Thanksgiving if we push. I stood very still in that hallway. The lake house she meant was a small cabin on Indian Lake that Eleanor and I bought the year Michael turned 12, the place where he learned to water ski and where Eleanor's ashes are scattered along the tree line she loved. I hadn't been out there in over a year. My knees don't love the dock steps anymore, but doesn't even use it, and doesn't want to let it go, are two very different sentences. And only one of them was true. I didn't say anything that night. I told myself I needed to understand the full shape of things before I reacted to a fragment of one conversation. That's the kind of caution that 30 years of business teaches a man, for better or worse. And that night, it was for worse, because caution and cowardice can wear the same coat if you're not careful, and I've thought about that more since than I'd like to admit. The dinner party happened that Friday. Michael and Danielle hosted 8 people I'd never met, business associates. It seemed people from the world of commercial contracts and municipal bids that Michael moved through now. I wasn't seated at the table. Nobody said it directly. It simply happened that when the chairs filled, there wasn't one left for me, and I ended up eating at the kitchen island, off to the side, while the dinner conversation rolled on 20 feet away like a river I'd been asked to admire from the bank. I heard my name over the noise of it. Michael's voice, warm with wine and the particular confidence men get when they're performing for an audience they want to impress. That's my dad you hear rattling around in the kitchen. Retired guy, lives on his own. We had him come stay a while since his place flooded. Laughter, easy and unbothered. And then, into his glass, not quite quiet enough. Honestly, my father's just dead weight at this point. Sweet old guy, but dead weight. I sat at that kitchen island with a fork halfway to my mouth, and I felt something in my chest go very still, the way water goes still right before it freezes. Not rage, not yet. Something colder and more specific than rage. The sensation of watching a door you'd been standing in front of your whole life quietly close from the other side. I finished my dinner. I did the dishes. I went down to my basement room, and I sat on the edge of that twin bed for a long time in the dark. And I thought about my father, and the percolator, and the parts warehouse, and the boy on the boat dock at Indian Lake learning to trust the water. And somewhere in that basement, in the dark, I stopped being a guest in my son's house and started being a man who had been patient long enough. I want to tell you what I did next wasn't about money, because that's the part people always want to hear about. The number, the reveal, the moment the son realizes what he mocked. But it started somewhere quieter than that. It started with a phone call to counsel the next morning, standing in Michael's backyard where the signal was best, watching Danielle's expensive landscaping sway in a wind that smelled like somebody else's autumn. I need everything on Michael's company, I told counsel. Not the version he tells people. The real version. Counsel was quiet for a moment. Harold, are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything, I said. Something's wrong over there, counsel. I can feel it the way I used to feel a bad shipment before I ever opened the crate. It took counsel 4 days to bring me what he found, and when he laid it out across the table at a diner outside Columbus, speaking low the way he always does when the news is heavy, I understood exactly how right my instinct had been, and exactly how much worse it was than I'd imagined. Michael's construction firm had bid on a public infrastructure contract with the city of Columbus, a bridge and road rehabilitation project worth $14 million, the largest bid of his company's history, the kind of contract that would move him permanently into a different league of builder. To win it, a company has to demonstrate bonding capacity and financial stability sufficient to guarantee completion, backed by audited financials submitted to the city's procurement office. Michael's actual financials, solid, respectable. The numbers of a well-run mid-sized firm weren't strong enough to clear the bonding threshold the insurers required. So Michael had done something I never taught him and never wanted him to learn. He'd had his accountant restructure the books, moving $2.3 million in short-term liabilities off the operating statement and into a shell entity Danielle's brother had quietly set up in Delaware, making the firm's balance sheet look nearly $3 million healthier than it actually was. He'd submitted those falsified financials to the city procurement office 3 weeks earlier. The bonding company was reviewing them now. If they cleared, Michael would close on the $14 million contract within the month, and that was exactly the timeline on which Danielle had already begun signing paperwork for the lake house transfer, and a council discovered had put a deposit down on a $1.8 million property in a new Sterling Oaks phase, banking entirely on a construction contract built on numbers that didn't exist. There's more, counsel said, and he has a way of saying, there's more that makes a diner booth feel smaller than it is. The bonding company Michael's working with, counsel continued, is Ashford Surety, and the senior underwriter reviewing his file, the man whose signature actually clears or kills this bid, is a fellow named Preston Cole. I've known Preston for 11 years. He handled the bonding on the Whitfield warehouse sale in 2009. I set my coffee down very carefully. You're telling me you know the man reviewing my son's fraud? I'm telling you I could call him this afternoon, counsel said. And I'm telling you that if I do, once he sees what I've seen, that bid dies before Michael ever gets near the signing table. And I'm telling you I won't do it unless you tell me to, because I know exactly what that means for a man's relationship with his son, and it's not my call to make. I sat in that booth for a long moment, looking at a man who had known me for 30 years, weighing a decision that no father should ever have to make about a son he still loved with his whole chest, fraud and all. And I thought about the boy on the dock at Indian Lake, and I thought about the man at the dinner table calling me dead weight into a wine glass, and I understood, finally, that those were not two different people. They were the same person, at two different distances from consequence, and only one version of him was ever going to learn anything. Make the call, I said. But counsel, I don't want him destroyed. I want him stopped. There's a difference, and I need you to understand it, because I'm not sure I trust myself to hold that line once this starts moving. I understand it, counsel said. I'll hold it for both of us if I have to. The next 3 weeks were the longest of my life, and I mean that with the full weight of a man who has buried a wife and buried a business partner and once sat in a hospital waiting room for 6 hours, not knowing if his son would walk again after a car accident at 17. I stayed in that basement room. I fixed what needed fixing. I said very little. And I watched my son move through his house like a man standing on ice he didn't know was already cracking, confident, expansive, already mentally living in the $1.8 million house Danielle had picked the light fixtures for. Then, on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks later, everything came apart the way I'd known it would. All at once, the way water finally breaks through a wall it's been quietly weakening for months. I was in the kitchen making my coffee when Michael's phone rang. I heard his voice change before I understood a single word of what was being said, the particular drop in pitch a man's voice makes when the ground underneath him disappears. "What do you mean disqualified?" he said, and then a long silence. And then, those numbers are accurate. I don't understand what you're... Another silence. Longer. Fraud. You're using the word fraud. His voice had gone very quiet by the end of it, the loudest kind of quiet there is. He came into the kitchen after the call ended and stood in the doorway, looking at me in a way he hadn't looked at me since he was young enough to still believe I had answers to every problem in the world. His face had gone the color of old paper. "The city pulled our bid," he said. "Ashford flagged discrepancies in our financials. They're calling it fraud, Dad. Fraud." He said the word like it belonged to somebody else's life. If this gets referred to the state attorney general's office, I could lose my contractor's license. I could lose everything. I looked at my son for a long moment before I answered, and in that moment, I felt the full weight of 30 years of silence pressing down on both of us at once. "Sit down, Michael," I said, and something in my voice must have carried a different register than he was used to hearing from me, because he sat. "I know about the shell company," I said. "I know about Danielle's brother in Delaware. I know about the $2.3 million you moved off the books. And I know about the house you two already put a deposit on, and the lake house transfer paperwork sitting on Danielle's desk that neither of you thought to ask me about before you started signing it. Michael's face went through several things at once: confusion, then something like fear, then, finally, the particular anger of a man who's been caught and doesn't yet know where to point it. How could you possibly know any of that? Because I asked a man named Counsel Reyes to find out, I said. The same Counsel Reyes who's managed my investments for 30 years, the same Counsel Reyes who knows Preston Cole, the underwriter who just flagged your bid. I watched the understanding move across my son's face like a shadow crossing a field, slow at first, and then all at once. You, he said. You did this. You got my bid pulled. I didn't falsify a single number on your financials, Michael, I said, and I kept my voice level because I had promised myself, sitting in that basement room 3 weeks earlier, that whatever this conversation became, it would not become the kind of thing I'd regret shouting. You did that yourself, before I ever knew you were building your entire future on a lie. What I did was make sure the lie didn't get to finish paying off before it collapsed on somebody else. A city, taxpayers, the crews who would have been counting on that bridge contract for 2 years of steady work. You could have just told me you found out. You could have given me a chance to fix it quietly. I gave you a chance, I said, and here, finally, the thing I'd been carrying for years came up, and I let it. I gave you a chance every single day for the last 3 weeks that you sat in this house calling me dead weight to a table full of strangers, while your wife planned the closing on my late wife's lake house like I was already dead and buried out there with her ashes. I watched you build an entire future on numbers that don't exist, and I asked myself every night whether the man doing that was still the boy I taught to bait a hook on that same lake. And Michael. I couldn't find him anymore. So I went looking for him, the only way I knew how. My son sat at that kitchen island, the same island where I'd eaten alone 3 weeks earlier while he called me dead weight 20 feet away and put his head in his hands. And I watched something break in him that had needed to break for a long time. Something that had been building pressure under a foundation just like the one that gave way under my own kitchen floor. Dad, I don't even know how deep this goes, he said, and his voice had lost every ounce of the confidence I'd been hearing on those phone calls for 3 weeks. The lawyer I need to call, the state board, Danielle, doesn't even know how bad it. He stopped. What am I supposed to do? You're supposed to call a lawyer this morning, I said. A real one. You're supposed to tell the city procurement office the truth before they finish finding it themselves, because a man who comes forward is treated very differently than a man who gets caught, and you are one phone call away from being the second kind instead of the first. And you're supposed to tell your wife that the lake house and the house in Sterling Oaks are not happening, not this year, maybe not for several years, because you are about to spend a long time rebuilding something you should never have let crack in the first place. And you? He asked. What do you get out of watching me lose everything? That question sat in the kitchen with us for a long moment, and I want you to understand that I asked myself the same thing many times over those 3 weeks, alone in that basement room, staring at a ceiling that wasn't mine. I don't get anything out of it, Michael, I finally said. I'm not doing this to win something. I'm doing it because I spent your whole childhood building something so you'd never have to cut corners to survive, and somewhere along the way, I let you believe survival was the same thing as winning at any cost, and that's on me as much as it's on you. This isn't revenge. I want to be very clear about that, because I know what it looks like from where you're sitting. A man getting revenge wants to watch you fall. I don't. I want to watch you get back up honest, even if it takes years, even if I don't get to see all of it. That's not revenge. That's just what love looks like when it finally stops being quiet. I didn't tell him about the $740,000 that day. It didn't feel like the moment for it, and honestly, by then, it felt almost beside the point, a detail that mattered far less than the one underneath it, which was that I had spent decades letting my son believe I had less than I did, and in that gap between what he believed and what was true, something had grown that neither of us liked very much. I told him 3 weeks later, after he'd hired the lawyer, after he'd gone to the procurement office himself before they came to him. After the state board's investigation concluded, he'd acted with what they called voluntary disclosure and remediation, which kept his license, though it cost him the contract, a significant fine, and every dollar of Danielle's deposits on both properties. I told him, sitting at that same kitchen island on an ordinary Tuesday evening, no dinner party, no audience, just the two of us and 2 cups of coffee going cold between us. I need you to know something, I said, and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything. And I told him about Whitfield Fastener and Supply, about the sale in 2009, about counsel, about the warehouse lease and the equity stake, and 30 years of a number I'd never once mentioned at a dinner table, because numbers have a way of changing how people look at a man before he's finished shaking their hand. Michael sat very still through all of it, and when I finished, he didn't ask about the money the way I half expected him to. He asked, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because I wanted you to build something that was yours," I said. "Something you could stand inside of and know, in your bones, that it came from you and not from me." And somewhere in there, Michael, I think I made a mistake. Because I let the silence become its own kind of wall, and walls don't teach anybody anything except how to feel alone on the other side of them. I should have told you the truth 20 years ago. Maybe it would have changed something. Maybe it wouldn't have. I'll never know now, because I never gave either of us the chance to find out. It's been 8 months since that Tuesday. Michael is rebuilding his company slower and smaller than it was, working contracts he can actually stand behind. And I know that because he calls me now, actually calls, not the distracted, dutiful calls from before, but real ones, the kind where he asks what I think and waits to hear the answer. Danielle and I are still finding our way to something steady. That one will take longer, and I've made my peace with that. The lake house is still mine. I drove out there myself last month, first time in almost 2 years. Sat on that dock with my bad knees complaining the whole way down, and scattered a little more of something back into that water that I think Eleanor would have understood without me needing to explain it. I don't consider myself a man who got revenge on his son. A man chasing revenge wants to watch the fire burn. All I ever wanted was to stop being the one holding a door open that my son needed to learn to open for himself. That's not the same thing. That's just a father, finally putting down something he'd been carrying quietly for far too long. If this story found something in you tonight, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Tell me which moment landed hardest, and tell me, like always, where in the country you're watching from. If you know a father who's been carrying more than anyone around him realizes, send this his way. And if you haven't yet, consider staying with us here. There are more stories coming, and I have a feeling some of them are going to surprise you, the way this one surprised me while I was living it. Thank you for sitting with me tonight, all the way to the end. It means more than you'd think, coming from an old man and his percolator.